The Arosa Line add-on in Train Sim World 3 is a prime example of why I dislike Rivet Games as a developer. Despite the great concept, being a meter gauge line in Switzerland and all that, it was ruined by poor or outright lazy execution. This thing was released in March 2021, costing 37 New Zealand dollars at the normal price, but it's quite unique in that it's the only route in the whole game that doesn't use standard gauge track. It's also one of only 2 Swiss routes in the game, but the less said about the awful S-Bahn Central Schweiz, the better. It is one of the shortest routes in the game, only including the 26 kilometres, or 16 miles of track, from Chur to Arosa, but it is at least a complete end-to-end route. Quite bizarrely, the first 2 kilometres are street running through the town of Chur, and the line climbs an impressive 1,000 metres in altitude despite its short length. The line opened in 1914 and was electrified right from the start, originally on 2,400 volts DC. In 1997, it was converted to run on 11,000 volts AC, the standard voltage used on the rest of the RHB network except the Bernina line. The Arosa line runs through very steep and hilly terrain with a rolling gradient of 1 in 17, which, if you don't know, is incredibly steep by railway standards. The maximum speed is very slow, with trains only being allowed to go as fast as 35 km per hour along this line. As a result, it takes at least 60 minutes to complete a full-length run. But despite the severe gradient, there is no rack and pinion system used here, with the locomotives instead relying on conventional adhesion to climb the grade. On the subject of motive power, Rivet's TSW remake is already worse than the original TS Classic version, because it doesn't include the ABE 8/12 Allegra EMU. Instead, you only get the GE 4/4 Mark II electric locomotive and nothing else. Originally, 10 of these things, numbers 611 to 620, were built in 1973, with another 13 examples, numbers 621 to 633, not being built until 1984. They used to have circular headlights, but starting in 1999, they were refitted with square headlights. This model in TSW depicts the class in its rebuilt condition, following the 2004 to 2008 upgrade program that saw the original analog electronics replaced with computer-based systems. Although the GE 4/4 Mark II does run on the Arosa line in real life, or at least did run on the Arosa line in real life, only having one motive power option in TSW makes the experience feel very restrictive, boring, and predictable. If the Allegra had been included, we would have the potential for some very unusual workings, as the EMUs are sometimes used as locomotives and end up hauling freight wagons or coaches, as well as themselves. Speaking of rolling stock, this add-on only includes 3 variants of the EW1 passenger coach, specifically one with a little first class compartment, one that's all second class, and one luggage van. The only freight wagon that comes with this add-on is the SP-W flatbed, which is used for carrying logs. There's a small aggregates terminal just down the hill from Arosa, and the original TS Classic version of this route actually included a hopper wagon, so that was a missed opportunity for more service variation in TSW. Go figure. Another item of rolling stock that wasn't included was the BDT 1751 to 1758 series cab cars, or the older ABT 1701 to 1703 series, for that matter. For reference, The older ABT coaches were built in 1969, rebuilt in 1997, and scrapped in the early 2010s, while the BDT coaches were built in 1999 and are still in service today. I don't know what year this route is set in, but it's disappointing to not see a cab car included for push-pull services with the GE 4/4 Mark II. Instead, you have to uncouple the locomotive and run her around the train at each end of the line, and that run-round move is quite bizarre. By default, you only get the standard Rhätische Bahn GE delivery for the GE 4/4 Mark II. But there is another payware add-on pack, released in December 2021, that includes 5 reskins depicting locomotives 619, 620, 623, 627, and 630 in special anniversary liveries. You also get a nice yellow observation coach and a new timetable, which are suitable for wintry conditions in December and January. But at a normal price of $18.49 in New Zealand's currency, this pack is far too expensive for what you get. It would have been a good opportunity to include more motive power, such as the Allegra EMU, rather than just giving us payware reskins. Take note, Skyhook. You should have at least included an SD40E with your pack for Horseshoe Curve, rather than just doing the lazy reskins of only 9 of the NS Heritage units. Quite frankly, I'm sick of these add-ons that are just payware reskins without giving us any new motive power. If you ask me, they are nothing short of lazy cash grabs. As for the locomotive sounds, they're honestly garbage. For starters, the motor sounds are reused from the 1972 tube stock, and they were originally recorded from a Class 455/9 in 2011 for TS Classic, instead of actually being recorded from a real GE 4/4 Mark II. I swear I've heard that overly loud fan somewhere else, and it seems like the only sound recorded from the real locomotive was the whistle. There's also a clattering sound effect that you hear when the locomotive goes over a set of points. It is reused from Rivet's original Isle of Wight add-on. That's the version with the Class 483, in case you're confused. The one with the 484 is called Island Line 2022. I've also noticed a bug where the whistle sound will randomly cut out or not work at all when you press the spacebar as normal. This bug still hasn't been patched despite the add-on now being 2 years old. Meanwhile, I noticed that the motor sounds will abruptly cut out when you return the throttle to idle, and it just doesn't sound right. It reminded me of Dovetail's terrible rehash of the Iron Horse House Class 303 model in TS Classic, which is so bad that it is absolutely undrivable without the Armstrong Powerhouse sound pack. So why they discontinued it is anyone's guess. Driving the GE 4/4 Mark II is very difficult, especially when you're going downhill towards Chur. Instead of a conventional throttle, the locomotive has a speed controller similar to the Deutsche Bahn BR143, and it will hold whatever speed you set it to when you're going uphill. When you're going downhill, you will need to use either the dynamic or vacuum brakes to stay within the severe speed limits. I find that 58 to 64% is the ideal position at which to apply or leave the dynamic brakes, as it's fairly easy to maintain the speed around that setting. Another major failure on this route is where the request stops are concerned. Out of the 6 intermediate stops, 4 are only made by request, namely Chur Altstadt, Leuenkasteel, St. Peter Molenus, and Peist. There is no proper request functionality or guard signal simulated here, and instead, the stations are just incorporated into the normal list of stops for timetable mode services. In real life, passengers have to press a button to illuminate a special black and white signal at either end of the station if they want to get on, while I assume that passengers wanting to get off would have to inform the guard, who is completely absent in TSW. Instead, it's all unrealistic driver-only operation here. Chur, Langwies, Lützelreuth, and Arosa are the only station stops that should appear in that list for the timetable mode services, while the others should all be unpredictable. In my opinion, the worst thing about this route is the awful scenery, especially where the trees on the distant mountains are concerned. Closer to the track, it isn't much better. And indeed, I thought the streets of Chur looked and felt very lifeless without a single pedestrian present. While you still get decent views from atop the iconic Langwies viaduct, as well as decent shots of trains crossing said viaduct, the poor distant scenery still takes you out of the immersion. If you run on this route in winter, the snow hides most of the poor scenery, but it can still be jarring in all 4 seasons. The route is relatively spartan in timetable mode, but this is at least realistic. Trains run once an hour in each direction for around 16 hours a day. They are scheduled to pass each other at Leuenkasteel and Lützelreuth, although there are more than just 2 crossing loops on this line. 3 separate locomotives and consists are required to maintain the hourly schedule. But the rail scene is still very boring because nearly every single train has the exact same consist. Behind the locomotive, it's always 1 composite coach followed by 2 standard class coaches and 1 luggage van. The only exceptions are the occasional log trains and winter passenger services, with the latter only consisting of 2 EW1 coaches and the observation coach. Such is the nature of including sod-all rolling stock. The standard gauge trains in Chur are nowhere to be seen in TSW. Instead, this side of the station doesn't have any detail whatsoever, while the Arosa Line platforms are just outside the station itself at Bahnhofplatz. It's an unusual starting point for an unusual line. And it's also worth mentioning that, while there are destination displays modelled at both Chur and Arosa, these are not functional, for whatever reason. In conclusion, I honestly think that the Arosa Line is one of the worst routes in TSW, but thankfully, it's not as bad as Hauptstrecke München to Augsburg or the Long Island Railroad. And indeed, I still drive on this route every now and then because I quite like the challenge. It's borderline appalling that this add-on is of such poor quality, given how unique and fascinating this line is in real life. One of many things that hold a TSW back, aside from Dovetail seemingly having contempt for their own customers as well as their questionable business practices, is the devs only bringing standard gauge lines to the game with just one exception, that being the Arosa Line. This game should have more narrow or broad gauge lines. And I also think that you'd be better off avoiding the Arosa Line and should try other TSW routes instead, despite the other ones all being standard gauge. If any other Swiss lines are recreated as TSW add-ons, then for the love of God, don't let Rivet Games make it.